Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm happy to take a call on what I'm sure will be many calls over the course of the next couple of hours on this bill. And this is to signal that Labor will be supporting this legislation, that we think this is a positive, tentative baby step in the first direction. In fact, Mr Speaker, we feel quite honoured to see this government stand up and take its first steps in front of us in terms of doing something about addressing climate change. Only wish we'd had the Polaroid camera here so we could have captured it for posterity. Because, Mr Speaker, what this does is a positive thing, but it cannot be seen in isolation. What the message that we want to give to the government is that this cannot be a cherry-picked idea from the emissions trading scheme review that exists in isolation. Because, Mr Speaker, what we fear is that the government sees the ETS as a strategy and not for the tool that it is in terms of managing our emissions. The Minister outlined the job that New Zealand has ahead of itself in terms of meeting its international emission reduction targets. And, Mr Speaker, it is a large job that New Zealand has ahead of itself in order to do this. The Minister seems to realise that we simply cannot trade our way out of this in the way that the previous Minister thought we could, and that we do actually have to do something. But, Mr Speaker, getting rid of the 1-for-2 subsidy within the emissions trading scheme cannot exist in isolation. If we truly want to address New Zealand's emissions, there are some other thorny issues that we must grasp. We must grasp the issue of agriculture and the fact that that is still remaining outside of our emissions trading scheme. When we have an emissions profile that 50% of our emissions come from a sector and we fail to include it in the tool that is charged with moderating our emissions in our economy and reducing our emissions in our economy, we are not going to have an effective tool. I also note that the price cap that is remaining there at $25 a tonne means that this great free market government isn't prepared to put a price floor of where a price cannot fall below, but it's willing to put a cap of where it cannot go. And, Mr Speaker, I note that this figure of $25 is out of kilter with what business and industry have been saying. Business and industry, when Business New Zealand's Energy Futures put together a very good report around energy consumption in our future, were modelling in 2050 on a price somewhere between $60 and $115 a tonne for carbon. So, Mr Speaker, we cannot have a government that continues to put in place these kind of ceilings on the price of carbon, because quite simply, Mr Speaker, it is this kind of thinking, this kind of 20th century thinking from this government when it comes to climate change that is going to fail to see us transform our economy in the way that we need to. They fail to see the opportunities that a low-carbon economy puts in front of us, the kinds of opportunities that it provides for jobs if planned correctly, and the failure to put together a comprehensive range of changes to the ETS illustrate this very clearly, Mr Speaker. That what we see here also is the ceiling of $25 a tonne. I would ask the Minister to think about putting in place an amendment when we get to the committee stages of this bill, to also put in place a price floor. Let's face the elephant in the room around the hot air credits that this government let in around the same time that they decided to put in place this 1-for-2. They let dodgy, fraudulent credits into our emissions trading scheme that crashed the price of carbon in this country and made it absolutely ineffective in reducing our emissions, made it absolutely ineffective in terms of doing the things that it needed to do as an effective means of being a lever in our economy to make those changes. So I know we are putting this legislation through under urgency, Mr Speaker, but I really do ask that the Minister think about an amendment that she could put up at the committee stages that would see that we will never return to that place. And the Minister has said that it is wrong and it can never happen again, but I would like to see a commitment, a legislative commitment, that that will never happen again. Because, Mr Speaker, this is a government that knew exactly what it was doing when it let fraudulent hot air credits into our emissions trading scheme. It is a government that sat back and let it happen and crashed the very thing that we could be doing to reduce our emissions trading. And one of the implications of allowing those fraudulent credits into our system is that we now have a backlog and we have a lot of banked Kyoto credits within our emissions trading scheme. And these have to be used before the Paris Agreement comes into force in 2020. So, Mr Speaker, this is make-up on what this government knows that it has done wrong. They simply cannot enter into the post-2020 world when the world must show a commitment, and New Zealand has to lift its game with the number of banked credits that it has sitting there. The government has to remove around 250 million tonnes of CO2 between 2021 and 2030 under the Paris Agreement, and will at best get 50 million tonnes of that removal out of new plantings, so that they know the emissions trading scheme, the ability to trade, is something that they absolutely have to have in place, and it has to be in there. And, Mr Speaker, one of the things when we're talking about the price of NZUs and we're talking about the $25 cap, that of course the government now speaks with great pride, saying that you can't buy the dodgy, fraudulent hot air credits that they previously let into our system. This wasn't because the government changed its mind and decided that it was wrong and we should stop the trade in this kind of dodgy credit. It's simply because New Zealand didn't enter into Kyoto 2, into the second protocol. But in a post-Paris world, what we will see happening is that New Zealand will once again start trading on the international market in terms of carbon credits. Now, New Zealand had a highly conditional target when it agreed at Paris what was going to happen. And one of those conditions around our agreement was the transparency work that needed to be put in place to ensure that international credits were both environmentally sound and to reduced carbon within the atmosphere somewhere in the world, which is what the dodgy credits we were buying in simply did not do. Now, for New Zealand, the Minister has gone to New York and she signed the Paris Agreement, and she is now saying that we can ratify that treaty. But we have to absolutely be sure that that transparency work is done if we're going to have a functioning and effective ETS. Because, Mr Speaker, for Labor, climate change and addressing climate change offers real opportunities. If we do this right and don't put in place false mechanisms, we have an opportunity to transform parts of our country, to create industries and to create jobs. And most importantly, Mr Speaker, if we start doing the planning now and we do that planning right, we have the opportunity to put in place the skills training that is going to be required for a low-carbon economy. Because a free market approach that just waits to see what happens, that we are seeing from this government in regard to climate change, is going to leave ordinary people high and dry. What we are committed to is a just transition when it comes to climate change, to make sure that we seize the opportunities and not one person gets left behind. We need to do more on climate change. New Zealand must reach its targets. This is a positive first step, but it is in no way enough. It needs to be accompanied by far more action on climate change, and I look forward for contributions from speakers coming out to tell me what other parts of of the ETS review that they will be putting in place. Why not a carbon floor as well as a carbon ceiling? What are the things we're going to do around agriculture to finally address that issue that will see a real reduction in New Zealand's greenhouse gases? Mr. Speaker, these are the hard questions that New Zealand must face, and these are the hard questions that Labor is willing to face.